Yes, conclusion.
So just click at the top button.
Cool. Okay, so hi everyone, my name's Simon. Can everyone hear me? Yep. Okay, cool. So, so my company's called Predict BGL, and what we do is we have an innovative product for diabetes, and we're trying to do something a little bit different to what everyone has done before in this space. So personally, I've had 26 years with type 1 diabetes. I also have a child with type 1 diabetes, so I know it from a parent angle, which is completely different. And I've been running a software company, as Guj said, for about 15 years. So I've got a bit of background in the industry, but not in the app space. And my background before that was sort of electrical engineering and computer science. So firstly, I want to cover a bit about the diabetes spectrum for those of you who aren't familiar with the range. We sort of think of it now a bit like sort of the autistic spectrum. There's a spectrum of diabetes as well. So on the left-hand side, we have type 1 diabetes who don't make any insulin. They must inject, they must blood test, they must count their carbs. And on the other extreme, we have people with type 2 diabetes. They often take tablets rather than insulin. They're generally controlled with weight and exercise. And then in the middle, there are spectrums in between. So often people with type 2 diabetes end up taking insulin as well. And sometimes they end up just like a type 1. In the center of the spectrum, we also have gestational and LADA or type 1.5, which has characteristics of both different types of diabetes, both an autoimmune component as well as sort of what we'd class as a lifestyle component. So not totally understood yet, but we're starting to think of it as a spectrum. So in terms of the size of this problem, there's about 380 million people in the world with diabetes today, and it's growing at an alarming rate. Now, in terms of Australia, in terms of the kind of money it costs you and I as taxpayers, it's about a $6 billion tax bill to look after all these people with diabetes. So for type 1s, there's a lot less of them. There's about 120,000 of them. And each year it costs about $3,500 to manage each person. If they have complications like blindness or heart failure, liver damage, kidney damage, that goes up to $17,000 a year. So we obviously want to try and minimise that. For type 2s, there's a lot more of them. It's more like 2 million people with type 2 diabetes. It costs around about $4,000 a year for each one, for all the tablets that they go on. And if they have complications, it's more like $10,000 a year. So those are things like amputations, kidney damage, eye damage, heart damage, and all the tablets that go with those extra conditions that have to be managed simultaneously. So on a worldwide scale, if you take the numbers, multiply it out, it's over $1 trillion a year that is spent on diabetes. And that's not really managing India and China particularly well. So our app is really focused on type 1 diabetes primarily. People who have multiple injections per day and who need to understand what's going on. And for the last pretty much 30 years, this is the kind of report that a person with type 1 diabetes would sit down with their doctor and look at and try and figure out what the hell is going on and what to change. So essentially what it's trying to show is different times of the day, what the blood tests were, and to figure out whether they're too high or too low, and therefore what dose to change. So looking at this, you can see, for example, so here's breakfast time, and about 3 hours later when the insulin has finished acting, there's some lows, there's some highs, and the same thing for lunch. After lunch, there's some highs, some lows, and same thing for dinner, some lows, some highs. And so I challenge you to figure out which dose to change out of any of those. And that's something that every doctor has to do. Whenever a patient visits them once every 6 months or once a year, and they say, make a change. And the patient doesn't know how to, because how can they possibly figure that out? Now, I'll put it to you that everyone in this room is smart enough to probably piece together something out of that. Most people in Australia cannot do that. They're not equipped to do it. Now, this is the current market leader in diabetes. It's a company called Gluku. Their claim to fame is basically having a cable that connects a blood test meter to a phone so the data can be uploaded to a doctor or an insurance company. And they get paid quite well by the insurance companies in the US for doing that. Now, all they're really doing is trying to put some stats together to say, most of the time after breakfast, your blood sugars were good or bad. Most of the time after lunch. But really, they miss the whole picture of what's going on because they only look at blood sugars. They don't look at insulin, they don't look at carbohydrate, and they don't look at the timing between them or at exercise. And down here, it's the same old crap. Okay, 30 years later, we still got the same kind of chart as I had on the previous screen, just they're trying to put a pretty facade over the top of it. So here's the problem. Lots of data logging, no real intelligence, no goalposts for people, no way of telling whether a blood test was good or bad, and no way of knowing which dose to change. So it's pretty pointless, and there's not much motivation to keep going. But the point is, what if you could predict what was going to happen? What if you had some idea about what the blood sugars should actually look like over a period of time, like 3 hours ahead, 1 hour ahead, 8 hours ahead? So that's what we're doing. we're basically putting together a system that uses analytics to understand the ranges that a blood sugar should be in 3 or more hours later, and also the curve that it follows. So we have at the moment the Predict BGL app. So it's in the App Store at the moment. It's unique in terms of prediction. We are the only company doing prediction. It also has live sharing, which other companies don't do for no apparent reason. It has dose coaching, so it can tell patients this dose was expected or unexpected, and therefore this is the dose you should change and by how much. We also import live fitness data. So if you're going for a jog, it'll incorporate that into the display and show, okay, you're going to have a low blood sugar in an hour's time. In terms of competition, we're about $4,500 cheaper than our closest comparable device, and we're a lot more user-friendly than a typical insulin pump. So looking at the way the app works, we have a dose calculator, which basically takes into account the blood sugar of the person, the carbohydrate they're having, any exercise and factors that might affect that. And you might think it's a lot of data that someone has to log. It's like, that's the life of someone with type 1 diabetes. You have to do this, okay? It's part of the deal. For type 2 is more of a stretch for us to do this sort of thing, but we can still predict for type 2s. So the inclusion of live fitness data in this is also really important because no other system does that, and that really improves the safety of the system in terms of predicting when someone will get low and adjusting their doses now so they don't get low in future, because that can be quite dangerous. So we're very precise, more precise than a pump, and we also avoid overdosing. But at the moment it's manual data entry and it's manual injections, because injections do the same thing as a pump. They're just an expensive device for doing the same thing. So the trace that we have, the main dashboard of the screen, it fills in the gaps between the blood tests so people understand what happens when they eat something. So 3 hours later, their blood sugar might be perfectly on track, but in between it skyrockets. And there's no way for them to know that without doing lots and lots of blood tests. And when they look at them, they'd say, oh, I don't know why it's so high. Well, there's a pretty obvious reason why, and our charts help them to understand why that happens. So by doing that, we can show them the amount of time. So for example, 79% out of range. We look today at the amount of time someone spends out of the normal range. And let's say if they spend 100% of the time with a blood sugar between 4 and 10, that's fantastic. And it leads to a lower risk of complications later on in life. So lower risk of heart disease, lower risk of kidney failure, lower risk of nerve damage, and other things that affect people with diabetes, both type 1 and type 2. We can also tell them when they're likely to have a low blood sugar. This can be quite dangerous. I don't know if any of you have encountered a person with diabetes with low blood sugar, but it can be anything from someone driving a car who doesn't know how to put the brake on because they've forgotten, to someone who is having a fit on the floor. But basically, a can of Coke is what they usually use to treat that, because there's a lot of sugar in it when that's needed to bring the blood sugar back up. So the second largest cause of ER visits in the world is basically people with diabetes with low blood sugars, extremely low blood sugars. Highest is cardiac arrest. Second highest is people who've got the wrong dose of insulin. So we help people to avoid those low blood sugars by looking ahead and saying when those events are going to occur, and putting the fitness data lets us do that really accurately as well. We also gamify the system. We try and help kids keep motivated to put in all this data and to understand what it's doing, and then a family can decide whether that translates to like money for a car or a trip to the shops or something like that. So where we're at. So a couple of years ago, we got a $50,000 grant from state government, which we used to build the app. So we used the guys at Bravo to put the app together for us. So they've done a fantastic job of the user interface. You haven't seen the majority of it there. We're doing Android shortly. We were in the US in June with 500 startups, so we're in a pre-accelerator program with them, which is fantastic. We have about 4,500 users around the world right now, and at the moment we're testing our pricing strategy, so looking at which people are ready to buy and why. So one of the keys to this is understanding when our system predicts, that's when it's really adding value. So we're looking at the data that comes back into our system, synchronized from the app, saying, okay, it's predicting really well for this person, so now's the time to hit them with a buy now button. The startup program in the US also structured us for US investment, which is obviously a key to getting started over there. And we're also doing licensing discussions at the moment with our doctor-facing software, which has the advantage of not being covered by regulatory, because doctors have the ability to interpret the data that they see. And the predictions are not always perfect. So in terms of a doctor having this system, it really helps them to adjust the doses. So what we're looking for, at the moment this system is based on a website that was done about 3 years ago. The app is pretty sexy, but the website's pretty crap. So we're looking for someone with a UX bent who really wants to make their mark, and we've got a system which is ready and waiting for someone to really apply whatever kind of styling and design and new thinking that they'd like to do. So if this is something that, if diabetes affects you or you know someone who is affected by it, this is your chance to really make a mark in an area which is really going to have a really big part to play in the way the world's going at the moment. That's it, thank you. So if you know someone with diabetes, please tell them about Predict BGL.